The swaddling clothes of the infant Jesus are at Aachen. The house of Mary, where the Annunciation took place, was transported through the air by angels from Nazareth to Loreto. Many churches hold what is claimed to be the hair of Mary. One hair, for example, is at Messina, or her milk. The sacred girdle of Our Lady is at Prato. Saint Joseph's wedding ring is at Perugia Cathedral. The engagement rings of Joseph and Mary are at Notre Dame in Paris. Saint Joseph's belt, brought to France by Joinville in 1254, is in the Church of the Feuillants in Paris, and his staff at the Camaldolese Church in Florence. There are also fragments of this staff in the churches of Santa Cecilia in Rome, Santa Anastasia in Rome, and San Domenico and San Giuseppe del Mercato in Bologna. There are fragments of the tomb of Saint Joseph at Santa Maria al Portico and Santa Maria in Campitelli in Rome. Fragments of the Holy Veil of Our Lady and the cloak of Saint Joseph are to be found at Santa Maria di Licodia, in Sicily, conserved in an artful silver reliquary made in the 17th century. Until the 1970s, this reliquary was carried in procession on the last Saturday of August to mark the festival of the patron saint. The body of Saint Peter was buried in Rome near where he was martyred, at the Circus of Nero. A basilica was built on the site during the reign of Constantine, and later, the present St. Peter's Basilica. In 1964, after archaeological excavations, it was announced that the apostles' bones had been found, and today they are beneath the altar. According to legend, the body of St. James, son of Zebedee, was transported by the currents to the Atlantic coast of Spain and buried in a place called Campus Steli. The sanctuary of Santiago de Compostela stands there today, one of the major pilgrimage destinations, along with Rome and Jerusalem, since the Middle Ages. The body of St. Thomas the Apostle is in the Cathedral of Ortona, Chieti, taken there in 1258 from Chios, an island in the Aegean Sea, where it had been brought to safety by Christians after the fall of Edessa in 1146. It had been taken to Edessa by order of the Emperor Alexander Severus in around 230 CE, from Madras, where Thomas had been martyred in 72 CE. One of the 30 pieces of silver for which Judas Iscariot betrayed Christ is in the sacristy of the Collegiate Church at Viso. A body of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle is in Rome, brought to Isola Tiberina by Pius IV, another is at the Church of San Bartolomeo in Benevento. In any event, both bodies ought to be without their skullcaps, since one is conserved in Frankfurt Cathedral and the other at the monastery of Lüneburg. It is not known which body the third skullcap comes from, which is now at the Charterhouse in Cologne. An arm, once again belonging to Saint Bartholomew, is in Canterbury Cathedral, though Pisa boasts possession of a piece of his skin. The body of Saint Luke the Evangelist is kept in the Church of Santa Justina in Padua. That of Saint Mark, originally kept at Antioch, was taken to Venice. What were said to be the remains of the Magi were conserved in Milan in ancient times. They were seized by Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century as spoils of war and taken to Cologne, where they remain. Some relics were returned to Milan in the 1950s and are now in the Church of Sant'Estorgio. The remains of Saint Nicholas of Bari, otherwise known as Santa Claus, were at Myra, in Asia Minor, until 1087, when they were smuggled away by seamen from Bari and transported to their city. The body of Saint Ambrose, patron saint of Milan, is buried in the crypt of the basilica dedicated to him, together with the bodies of Saints Gervas and Protes. In the Basilica of Saint Antony of Padua are the saint's tongue and fingers. The hand of Saint Stephen of Hungary is kept in the basilica at Budapest. 2 ampules of the blood of Saint Januarius are in Naples. Part of the body of Saint Judith is in Nevers Cathedral, while a fragment of bone is kept in a magnificent rock crystal reliquary in the crypt of the Medici Chapel at San Lorenzo in Florence. At Misterbianco, in Sicily, the arm of Saint Anthony the Great is displayed every January 17th. That of Saint Benedict of Norcia was donated to the monastery of Leno, near Brescia, in the 8th century at the behest of King Desiderius. The body of Saint Agatha at Catania was divided up, and the goldsmiths of Limoges made reliquaries for the limbs. One for each thigh, one for each arm, and one for each lower leg. One was made in 1628 for her breast, but the ulna and radius of her forearm are at Palermo, in the Royal Chapel. One of Saint Agatha's arm bones is at Messina, in the monastery of the Santissimo Salvatore, another at Ali, just outside Messina. One of her fingers is at Sant'Agata dei Goti, Benevento. The body of Saint Peter of Verona is in the Portinari Chapel at Sant'Estorgio, in Milan. Devotees banged their heads against his sarcophagus on April 29 to ward off headaches. The remains of Saint Gregory of Nazianzus are at St. Peter's in Rome, but a portion was donated by Pope John Paul II to the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2004. Relics of Saint Lucidus are at Aquara, near Salerno. They were stolen several times and the head was eventually found by police in a private house in 1999. Relics associated with Saint Pantaleon, the sword that cut off the saint's head, the wheel on which he was tortured, the torch used to burn his flesh, the trunk of an olive tree that sprouted on contact with his body, are to be found in the church named after him at Lanciano, in the Abruzzo. A rib of Saint Catherine is at Asnet in Belgium. One of her feet is in the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. A finger and her head, detached from her body in 1381 by order of Pope Urban VI, are in the Basilica of San Domenico in Siena. A piece of Saint Blaise's tongue is at Carasino, near Taranto, an arm in the cathedral at Ruvo di Puglia, and his skull at Dubrovnik. We can find a tooth of Saint Apollonius in Porto Cathedral, the body of Saint Judas Syriacus in Ancona Cathedral, the heart of Saint Alpheus at Lentini in Sicily, the body of Saint Roch in the high altar of the Church of the Scuola Grande in Venice, part of the shoulder bone and another bone fragment at Silla, part of an arm bone in the Church of San Rocco at Voghera, near Pavia, another piece of arm bone at the church of the same name in Rome, a tibia and other small parts of the Massa Corporis and what is said to have been his staff in his sanctuary at Montpelier, a phalanx bone in the parish church of Cisterna di Latina, part of his heel in Fragento Cathedral, and several bone fragments in the Basilica Mauriziana and the church of the Confraternita di San Rocco in Turin. Relics were venerated in Constantinople but dispersed after the Fourth Crusade, such as Our Lady's mantle, the Mephorion, Christ's sandals, the cloak of St. John the Baptist, an ampule of Christ's blood used to sign certain solemn documents, the parapet of the well where Christ met the Samaritan woman, the stone on which Christ's body was laid after his death, Solomon's throne, Moses' rod, the remains of the innocents slaughtered by Herod, a piece of dung dropped by the donkey on which Jesus entered Jerusalem, the icon of the Hodegetria, an image of Mary and child said to have been painted by St. Luke, other icons considered miraculous since they were not painted by human hand, Acheiropoeta, and the Mandylion, the cloth imprinted with the face of Christ, originally at Edessa, where it was famed for making the city impregnable when displayed on its walls. I wouldn't wish to give the impression that the conservation of relics is exclusively a Christian, or indeed Catholic, practice. Pliny tells us about the treasured relics of the Greco-Roman world, such as Orpheus's lyre, Helen's sandal, or the bones of the monster that attacked Andromeda. And by the classical period, the presence of a relic already provided a point of attraction for a city or for a temple, and was therefore a valuable tourist commodity, as well as a sacred object. The cult of the relic is to be found in every religion and culture. It depends, on the one hand, upon a sort of impulse that I would describe as mythomaterialistic, so that by touching parts of the body of great men or saints we are able to experience something of their power, and, on the other hand, upon a normal antiquarian taste for the past, so that a collector is prepared to spend money to have not just the first edition of a famous book, but also the book that belonged to an important person. In this second sense, though perhaps in the first two, there is also a secular cult of the relic. All we have to do is read Christie's auction catalogs to see how a pair of shoes belonging to a famous diva is being offered at prices higher than that of a picture by a Renaissance painter. These kinds of memorabilia can be the actual gloves of Jacqueline Kennedy or those simply worn by Rita Hayworth for the filming of Gilda. In that respect, I have seen tourists in Nashville, Tennessee, going to admire Elvis Presley's Cadillac, which by the way wasn't the only one, since he changed them every 6 months. The most famous relic of all times is, of course, the Holy Grail, but I wouldn't advise anyone to set out in search of that, or those, since past experiences haven't been too encouraging. In any event, it has been scientifically proven that 2,000 years aren't long enough. An earlier Italian version, titled Andare per Tesseri, appeared in Milano, Meraviglie, Miracoli, Misteri, edited by Roberta Cordani, Milan, CELIP, 2011. A second expanded version, in Attesa di una semiotica dei Tesseri, was published in Testure, Scritti Seriosi e Schizzi Scherzosi per Omar Calabresi by Stefano Giacoviello and others, Siena, Protagon, 2009. Fermented Delights. My relations with Piero Camporesi were always very friendly and cordial, marked by a mutual esteem, or at least I hope they were, to the point where I plundered choice quotes from him for my novels The Name of the Rose and The Island of the Day before, and he asked me to write a preface for the English edition of his book on blood. But we always tended to meet in academic circles, at university course committees, in faculty corridors, or perhaps in the porticoed streets of Bologna, and I never got to know him in any private setting or to visit his library. So far as I know, Camporesi was a gourmet. He enjoyed good food and I'm told he was a good cook. No surprise for a writer who dedicated so many pages not just to the pains but also the pleasures of the body, to milk, sauces, and dressings. Nor should we expect anything else from someone who once declared, in a newspaper interview in August 1985, that, after having studied Petrarch, the Baroque, Alfieri, and Romanticism, his discovery of Pellegrino Artusi toward the end of the 1960s had been devastating. But my knowledge about Camporesi's passion for food is only bookish. I have dined with him only in the pages of his books. I am therefore qualified to celebrate Camporesi the gourmet simply as an avid reader of his work. He wrote about squalor, bodily waste, and putrefaction, and at the same time about his lusts and ecstasies. But he did so by delving with his scalpel into the bodies of books, by which I mean into books describing bodies, and, like a latter-day Mondino de Liuzzi, he went about dissecting not corpses stolen from cemeteries, but books unearthed from the musty depths of libraries where they had often languished forgotten, concealing their delights, in the way that the character De Essentis in Joris Karl Huysmans' Erebors went about rediscovering in neglected early medieval chronicles. The stammering grace, the often exquisite clumsiness of the monks, stirring the poetical leftovers of antiquity into a pious stew. Verbs of refined sweetness, substantives smelling of incense, and strange adjectives crudely fashioned out of gold in the delightful barbaric style of Gothic jewelry, translated by Robert Baldrick. Of course, if Camporesi had wanted literature in which to lick his lips while savoring excessive intemperate and obsolescent words, he could have turned to such classics of linguistic corruption as that Italian forerunner of Joyce, Hübnerodomachia Polyphili, or the macaronic macaroni of Teofilo Folengo, or, if he had wanted to gorge himself on modernity, Carlo Emilio Gadda. Instead, he went off in search of unknown texts or books that were familiar in other respects. Having read Camporesi's works, we certainly know much more about blood, bread, wine, and chocolate, in the same way that we learn extraordinary things about hunger, worms, buboes and scrofula, fiber, intestines, vomit, greed, as well as funfairs and carnivals. But I would venture to suggest that these explorations would be fascinating even if the phenomena he writes about had never actually taken place, even if Camporesi had been telling us about bodies and bodily nourishment of aliens from Venus, somewhere too far away to arouse any sense of attraction or disgust. By which I mean that it is fascinating to know that remote centuries were peopled by bands of vagrants, but more fascinating still to discover this purely flatus vocis, and to read about fake monks, charlatans, rogues, swindlers, beggars and ragamuffins, lepers and cripples, peddlers, tramps, ballad singers, itinerant clerics, scholar gypsies, card sharps, jugglers, maimed soldiers, wandering Jews, madmen, fugitives, convicts with docked ears, or sodomites. It is not pharmaceutics but lexicography or linguistic history that we are most aware of when reading his descriptions of poppy syrups, ointments, unguents, baths, inhalants, powders, tinctures, spongia somnifera soaked in opium juices, henbane, hemlock, mandrake. We open The Anatomy of the Senses, 1994, at the first chapter, The Cursed Cheese. We know that cheese, though it comes from a pure and sweet liquid, milk, is more appetizing the more it tastes of putrefaction, and reminds us of molds and those body odors we usually try to get rid of with footbaths and bidets. And this is well known not only to the glutton but especially to the gourmet. Yet I doubt whether Camporesi would have been able to write 28 pages on the iniquities of cheese by simply sniffing Gorgonzola and Stilton, or letting the taste of Formaggio di Fossa, Reblochon, Roquefort, or Vacherin linger on his tongue. He had to go off exploring forgotten pages of Campanella's De Sensu Rerum et Magia, or, worse still, retrieving from the 17th century, that most neglected period, Il Mercato della Meraviglia di Natura by Niccolò Serpetro, the Physica Subterranea by Joachim Becker, De Causae Nequidia by Johann Peter Lodicius, and Intorno ai Latticini by Paolo Boccone, thus superimposing on the actual aroma of cheese this even ranker and more putrid collage of quotations. For many centuries, many people believed in the intrinsic malevolence of cheese, and its iniquity could be detected from its smell, which for many was sickening and nauseating, a sure indicator of dying matter. It was a decomposing residue of degenerate and harmful substances, and a terrible corrupter of humors. A foul and fetid thing, res fetida et feta, the excremental part of milk, made up of harmful waste, coagulated from the earthy sludge of the white liquid. Lodicius often uses the verb, to copulate, core, when referring to the coagulation of these inferior parts of the milk. Butter, on the other hand, constituted the best part. It was an elect, pure, and divine delicacy, termed Jupiter's marrow, Jovis medulla. Cheese, however, was variously described as something foul, rank, filthy, and decaying, or a shapeless mass, evil smelling from the dross of milk, from bits of vegetables and refuse, but a source of nourishment, whether curdled or combined. It was suitable only for laborers and the lower classes. As something rustic and filthy, it was not worthy of decent people and honored citizens. It was, in other words, a food for the ragged peasant who was accustomed to eating bad foods. Lodicius saw those who ate cheese as sordid and degenerate lovers of putrefied substances. Pre-scientific medicine not only agreed with him, but supplied easy arguments to demonstrate the iniquity of cheese, because the humors could only be disturbed and corrupted by fetid and putrid foods. Eating them triggered an uncontrollable proliferation of the worms that, even in normal conditions, teem in the intestines which are their hiding place. This was the terrible truth. Cheese increased the existing putrefaction in the dark meanders of the intestines and the recesses of the human bowels, generating disgusting little monsters. Lodicius argued that the propagation of thousands of vile little animals must occur in human intestines, just as the putrefaction spontaneously created. Cow dung released an abundance of cockroaches, grubs, wasps, and drones, and the dew generated butterflies, ants, locusts, and cicadas. This process was uncontrolled and astounding in that it did not require copulation and the fertilization of eggs. He could not see how the lower abdomen filled with human manure could possibly avoid fermenting the same profusion of perplexing little animals which were a scourge to humanity. Why could not the same thing occur, given that earthworms and tapeworms all draw their origin from phlegmatic, dense, and rough matter, translated by Alan Cameron? And similarly his exploration of forgotten writings did not end at De Spiritu Ardente ex lact bubulo by the 18th century Nicolaus Ozereczkowski, which tells us how the Tartars got drunk on fermented milk. Only Camporesi, among the few devotees who have read La Vita della Venerabile Madre Maria Margherita Alacoque of 1784, about the saint who first saw the Sacred Heart of Jesus, could have extracted from her biography the shocking information that this mystic saint, though ready for any mortification of the senses, could not overcome her disgust for cheese, to the extent that she was tempted to abandon monastic life so as avoid being forced by her vow of obedience to eat that horrible yet humble food, before succeeding in making the supreme sacrifice. Which prompts Camporese's comment that, the unbelievable conflict led the saint to the verge of suicidal desperation as her tormented soul struggled over a piece of cheese. Now, I have to say, the story existed and exists in that saint's biography, but heaven only knows how any human being could have had the idea of searching about among those most saintly pages for some lines on cheese. Perhaps Camporese never ate cheese, a suggestion I make only out of a love of paradox, but he certainly had a voracious appetite for pages and pages of countless books that had ended up goodness knows where, and this was his heavenly and guilty camembert. If this suggestion might appear excessive, see how Camporese can describe an execrable, or at least execrated, food such as cheese with the same ease that he talks about culinary delights that make our mouths water, or about the practices of penitence that would cause any sensitive soul to feel sick. And when discussing Prince Raimondo di Sangro, rather than going off, like everyone else, on an exploration of his mummified monstrosities and chilling displays of nerves, muscles, and veins laid bare, instead he examines his Archibaldian fancy for counterfeiting food, so that, being quite excessively self-indulgent in all things, on certain days, he ordered an entire dinner to be prepared using nothing but vegetables, on other days nothing but fruit, on yet others nothing but sweet and honey dishes, and sometimes dishes all made from milk. He had skilled buffet experts so highly trained in the art of manipulating sweetmeats and dairy products that he could produce marvelous imitations, with milk and honey, of all the dishes the cooks normally make with meat, fish, and many other sorts of animals. They also knew how to counterfeit every kind of fruit in 1,000 different ways. Exotic Brew, 1994, translated by Christopher Woodall. But likewise, in the same spirit, here he is reading Sebastiano Paoli in his Predicae Quaresimali, Lenten sermons, making our hair stand on end while he relishes certain pious recommendations when it comes to a peaceful death. As soon as this well-constituted and well-organized body is closed in its coffin, it changes color and becomes yellow and sallow, but it is a pallor and sallowness that nauseate and incite fear. It then blackens from the head to the feet, and it is covered by a somber and dismal color like spent coal. Then it starts to swell in a strange manner across the face, chest, and stomach, and a fetid and greasy mold starts to grow on this sickening swelling, a filthy indication of imminent corruption. Very soon the yellow and swollen stomach starts to rip here an eruption and there a tear, and out of these there flows a slow lava of decaying material and foulness in which bits of that black and rotting flesh are floating. Here half a maggot-infested eye is carried on a wave, there a cleft lip is putrid and corrupt, and further on there lies a bundle of livid and lacerated bowels. A great quantity of small flies, worms, and other disgusting little animals is generated by this greasy mire, and they swarm and infest the corrupted blood, attach themselves to decomposing flesh, and devour it. One part of these worms rises from the chest, and another from the nostrils, with I don't know what filth and mucus. Still others, covered by putrid matter, enter and leave by the mouth, and the more satiated come and go, and gurgle continuously down in the throat. The anatomy of the senses. Is there a difference between describing a Trimalchian dinner in a land of plenty, bringing to mind Dario Fo, in Mistero Buffo, who froths with pleasure over food he is only dreaming about, or taking delight before the horrid spectacle of the damned in the Lenten sermons of Romolo Marcelli and the descriptions in Padre Signeri's sermon on the spectacle of the lower realm of the damned, who endure the greatest punishment by seeing the Almighty laugh at their suffering? And yet when they raise their eyes and turn to the great God who lit the fire, they see that he now appears like Nero to them, not because of his injustice but because of his severity. Not only does he not wish to console them, or pity them, but what is more he claps his hands together, and with incredible pleasure, he laughs at them. Imagine in what frenzy they are driven, and into what a rage. We are burning and God laughs? O most cruel God, we let ourselves be deluded by the man who told us that our greatest torment would have been the sight of God's scornful face. God's laughing face, he should have said, God's laughing face. The Fear of Hell, 1990, translated by Lucinda Byatt. I see no difference between the eagerness with which Camporese savors, in the pages of Giovan Battista Barpo's La Delizia e I Frutti dell'Agricoltore e della Villa, the lists of salted beef and lamb, mutton, pork and veal, and then spring lambs, capons, hens and ducks, and then of parsley roots, which, when boiled, floured, and cooked in oil, are just like lampreys. Or pasta made from flour, rosewater, saffron, and sugar, with a little malmsey, cut round, like window panes, and stuffed with breadcrumbs, apples, carnation flowers, and ground walnuts, while waiting for Easter to bring kid, veal, lamb, asparagus, and squabs and, over the following months, curd cheeses, fresh ricotta, peas, heads of cabbage, boiled beans floured and fried, the anatomy of the senses, between such lists of things dedicated to the palate and other lists dedicated, even though they refer to people, only to the ear, an ear whose Eustachian tubes are as voraciously greedy as any throat. Examples of those lists of villains are found in the Speculum Seretinorum and other works on villainy. Cardsharps, cheats, rascals, villains, wastrels, ne'er-do-wells, tricksters, fraudsters, pimps, fagins, abortionists, sellers of miraculous waters, quacks, paupers verecundi, prayer vendors, fathers begging with their children, fake saffron vendors, rogues who cheat other rogues, relic sellers, flower beggars, gropers, baptized Jews, fake priests, shivering jimmies, bread beggars, rogues feigning madness from tarantula bites, holy image bearers, fake miracle workers, usurers, fake paralytics, dealers, street singers, epileptics, false weepers, charlatans, and so on, il libro dei vagabondi, are not very politically correct lists of the defects of women, taken from the pages of Poetiche Dicerie ovvero Vagissime Descrizioni by Tommaso Carafa, which might seem to describe the edible virtues of some extremely rare wild animal. Do you not know that woman was called the portrait of inconstancy, the model of fragility, the mother of cunning, the symbol of variance, the mistress of malice, the minister of frauds, the inventrix of deception, the friend of simulation and of imperfection itself? Since her voice is weak, she is voluble in tongue, tardy in action, fast in anger, steadfast in hatred, quick in envy, readily tired, well versed in evil, easily prone to lying, like a biting asp nesting in an open field, like dead cinders that conceal a burning ember, a false reef concealed among shallow waters, a prickly thorn covered by lilies and roses, a poisonous snake wrapped in herbs and flowers, a light that fades, a flame that burns out, a glory that falls, a sun eclipsed, a moon that wanes, a star that disappears, a sky that darkens, a shadow that vanishes, and a sea that ruffles. I. Balsami di Venire, 1989. If it is still not clear that Camperessi was a gourmet of lists, see the shameless greed with which he gleefully describes the poor and piteous table of the penitent saints, such as Joseph of Cupertino, as found in an 18th-century life, whose table was furnished with herbs, dried fruits, and cooked broad beans sprinkled only with bitters powder, and who on Friday fed on a herb that was so bitter and disgusting that even to lick it with the tip of the tongue nauseated him for several days. Or the description in the life of Carlo Girolamo Severoli of Faenza, servant of God, who sprinkled his bread with ashes, which he secretly carried around with him for the purpose, and dipped it into the water used for washing dishes, and sometimes put it to soak in verminous water. Thus, quite rightly, such was the manner and number of his self-inflictions and abstinences that his appearance was completely transformed. His countenance was pallid and his bones were barely covered by his bloodless skin, so much had he wasted away. A few meager hairs sprouted from his chin and his frame was bent and transfigured, so that he had become bare like a skeleton, a living image of penitence. He suffered as a consequence most grievously of languidness, fainting, swooning, and a death-like pallor, so extreme that on journeys he was sometimes obliged to stop and he would sink to the ground to recover some little strength in his flagging limbs, or to relieve the pains of a hernia and other ills, for which he refused to seek any remedy. The Incorruptible Flesh, 1988, translated by Tanya Croft Murray. If we were to read all of Camperessi's books, one after the other, though they should be savored in small doses, trying to build up a picture of what he is describing, we might become sated and form the suspicion there isn't much difference between an urge to swim in cream and to swim in excrement, so that his work might serve as a gospel or a Koran for the characters in Ferreri's film Le Grande Bouffe, at the end of which ingurgitation and evacuation go hand in hand. This would be true if we assumed that Camperessi is talking only of things, rather than realizing that he is talking first and foremost about words. The words paradise and inferno, after all, are part of one and the same poem. Camperessi certainly wanted to be a cultural anthropologist, or historian of everyday life, though he performed this task by probing among long-forgotten works, and in doing so he recounted the vicissitudes of past centuries in relation to the body and food. But not infrequently he highlights parallels between those times and ours, and reflecting on ancient blood rituals and myths he never failed to point out how much blood has been spilled in our own most civilized age, whether it be through Holocaust, intifada, genocide, tribal throat-slitting, or massacre, and nor did he ever fail to comment on the perversions of today, from dietary paranoia to mass hedonism, from olfactory decadence to the adulteration of food, as well as the disappearance of the traditional view of hell. He looked back almost nostalgically upon less fastidious and more honest times when you could smell the blood that was spilled, when masochistic mystics kissed leprous ulcers, and excrement was sniffed as part of the sensual panorama of everyday life. I wonder what he would have written about the rubbish piles in Naples. But this desire to understand the past and the present arose through that form of libido that has been dubbed librido. Nor could Camperessi savor the aroma of a well-made pie or the stink of a rotting body except through the whiff of paper made from pulp rags, duly watermarked, slyly foxed, and adorned with wormholes, provided it was, as bibliographers would have once said, de la plus insigne rare. Lecture given at the International Study Conference on Piero Camperessi in March 2008 at Forlì. Then published in Camperessi nel Mondo, edited by E. Casali and M. Sofriti, Bologna, Bononia University Press, 2009. No embryos in paradise. It is not my intention in this lecture to support philosophical, theological, and bioethical positions on problems relating to abortion, stem cells, embryos, and the so-called right to life. My approach is purely historical and seeks to examine what St. Thomas Aquinas thought about such matters. At most, the fact that the Church of today thinks differently makes my reconstruction particularly curious. The debate is extremely old, dating back to Origen, who claimed that God created human souls that had existed from the very beginning. His view was immediately challenged, not least in the light of the words of Genesis 2-7, that the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. In the Bible, therefore, God creates the body, and then breathes a soul into it, and this doctrine, which became the Church's official doctrine, is called creationism. But this position posed problems so far as the transmission of original sin. If the soul is not transmitted by the parents, why are babies not free from original sin, so that they have to be baptized? Thus Tertullian, in De Anima, claimed that the soul of the parent is translated from father to son through his semen. But Traducianism was immediately judged to be heretical, since it presumed that the soul had a material origin. The person who found himself in difficulty was St. Augustine. He had to reckon with the Pelagians, who denied the transmission of original sin. He therefore supported the creationist doctrine against bodily Traducianism, while admitting, at the same time, a sort of spiritual Traducianism. But all commentators take the view that his position is rather convoluted. Augustine was tempted to accept Traducianism, but finally, in Epistle 190, he admits to being uncertain and observes that the Holy Scriptures support neither Traducianism nor creationism. We can also see how he wavers between the two positions in De Genesi ad Litteram. St. Thomas Aquinas was decidedly creationist, and resolved the question of original guilt in a most elegant way. Original sin is transmitted by semen like a natural infection. Summa Theologica, second part of part 1, question 81, article 1, reply to objections 1 and 2, but this has nothing to do with the transmission of the rational soul. It is said that the child will not carry the iniquity of the father in the sense that he will not be punished for the sin of the father, unless he is a party to the blame. But this is what happens in our case. In fact, original sin is transmitted from father to child through procreation, in the same way that actual sin is transmitted by imitation. Yet the soul is not transmitted, because the power of the semen is not able to produce a rational soul. Nevertheless, the semen cooperates as an instrument. Thus, through the power of the semen, human nature is transmitted from parents to children, and the corruption of human nature with it. In fact, he who is born becomes a party to the guilt of his parent, because by force of procreation, he inherits his nature from him. If the soul is not transmitted with the semen, then when is it introduced into the fetus? Remember that, according to Thomas, plants have a vegetative soul, which in animals is supplanted by the sensitive soul, whereas in human beings these two functions are supplanted by the rational soul, which is what produces intelligent man, and what, moreover, makes a person, insofar as the person was, by ancient tradition, an individual substance of a rational nature. It is the rational soul that will endure the corruption of the body and will be sent to damnation or to eternal glory. This is what makes man what he is and distinguishes him from an animal or a plant. Thomas has a very biological view about the formation of the fetus. God introduces the soul only when the fetus acquires, stage by stage, first a vegetative soul and then a sensitive soul. Only at that point, in a body already formed, is the rational soul created. Summa, part 1, question 90. Therefore the embryo has only a sensitive soul. Summa, part 1, question 76, article 3. The philosopher teaches that the embryo is first animal and then man. But this cannot be so, if the essence of the sensitive soul and the intellective soul are identical. Since an animal is so made from its sensitive soul, man however is so constituted by that intellective soul. The essence of the sensitive soul and the intellective soul is therefore not the same. We must therefore conclude that in man there exists one soul, which is sensitive, intellective, and vegetative. This can be easily explained if we consider the differences of species and forms. For we observe that the species and forms differ from one another according to various grades of perfection. Thus in the order of nature animate beings are more perfect than inanimate beings, animals more than plants, men more than beasts, and in each of these kinds there are various grades. For this reason Aristotle compares the various animals to geometrical figures, one of which contains another so that, for example, the pentagon contains and transcends the rectangle. In a similar way, the intellective soul contains virtually all that belongs to the sensitive soul of animals and the vegetative soul of plants. Therefore, in the same way that the surface of the pentagon is not a rectangle because it has one figure different to that of the rectangle, so that the figure of the rectangle being contained in the pentagon would be superfluous. Likewise, Socrates is not a man by one soul and animal by another, but he is both man and animal by the same soul. The embryo has first of all a soul that is merely sensitive, and when eliminated, it is supplanted by a more perfect soul, which is both sensitive and intellective. In the Summa, part 1, question 118, article 1, reply to objection 4, it is said that the sensitive soul is transmitted with the semen. In perfect animals, generated by coitus, the active force, according to the philosopher, is in the semen of the male, but the fetal matter is provided by the female. This vegetative soul exists in this material from the very beginning, not at a later instance but in the initial act, like the sensitive soul exists in one who sleeps. But when it begins to attract nourishment, then it actually operates. This matter is therefore transmuted by the power enclosed in the semen of the male, until it becomes the sensitive soul. Not in the sense that the power present in the semen passes to become the sensitive soul, because in such a case, the generator and the generated would be the same thing, and the process would be more like nourishment and growth than generation, as the philosopher observes. But when, by the power of the active principle in the semen, the sensitive soul is produced in the principal structure of the generated being, then the sensitive soul of the offspring begins to work toward the perfection of its own body, through the acts of nutrition and development. The active power of the semen ceases to exist as soon as the semen is dissolved and the spirit enclosed within it has vanished. Nor is there anything strange in this fact, because this force is not a principal agent, but instrumental, and the movement of the instrument ceases once the effect is produced in the being. And in the Summa, Part 1, Question 118, Article 2, Reply, Thomas denies that the power of the semen can produce the intellective element, and therefore that a soul exists at the moment of conception. Since the intellective soul is an immaterial substance, it cannot be caused through procreation, but only through creation by God. Anyone admitting that the intellective soul is transmitted by semen would also have to admit that it does not exist alone and, as a result, that it is corrupted upon the corruption of the body. In the same question, ad secundum, Thomas also denies that to the vegetative soul, present at the beginning, there is added another, namely, the sensitive soul, and after this another still, that is, the intellective soul. In this way man would have three souls, so that one would be in the power of another. And he denies that the same soul, which at the beginning was merely vegetative, then develops, by action of the power of the semen, until it also becomes sensitive, and finally develops until it becomes an intellective soul, not just by the active power of the semen, but through the power of a superior agent, namely God, who would come from outside to illuminate it. But this does not hold. First, because no substantial form is susceptible of more or less, but the addition of greater perfection changes the species, just as the addition of unity changes the species of number. Now it is not possible for the same identical form to belong to different species. Secondly, because it would follow from this that the generation of an animal would be a continuous movement, proceeding from the imperfect to the perfect, as happens in alteration. Thirdly, because the generation of a man or an animal would no longer be generation in the strict sense, because their subject would already be taking place. For if the vegetative soul is in the matter of offspring from the beginning, and is subsequently gradually brought to a state of perfection, this would involve an addition of further perfection without destruction of the preceding perfection. And this is contrary to the concept of generation in the strict sense. Fourthly, because that which is caused by God is either something subsistent, and thus it must needs be essentially distinct from the pre-existing form, which was non-subsistent, and we shall then come back to the opinion of those who held the existence of several souls in the body. Or else it would not be subsistent, but a perfection of the pre-existing soul, and then the intellective soul would perish with the body, and this is unacceptable. We must therefore say that, when a more perfect form supervenes, the previous form is corrupted, since the generation of one being always implies the corruption of another being, both in men and in animals. And this occurs in such a way that the subsequent form has all the perfections of the previous form, and something more. In this way, through various generations and corruptions, we arrive at the ultimate substantial form, both in man as well as in other animals. And this can also be seen in animals generated from putrefaction. We must conclude therefore that the intellective soul is created by God at the end of human generation, with the disappearance of the pre-existing forms, and that this soul is both sensitive and nutritive. The rational soul, at the moment in which it is created, therefore formats, so to speak, the two souls, vegetative and sensitive, and recharges them as an integral part of the rational soul. In the Summa contra Gentiles, Book 2, Part 89, Reply to Argument 11, it is repeated that there is an order, a grading in the generative process, due to intermediate forms in which the fetus is equipped from the beginning until its final form. 1. At what point in the formation of the fetus is it infused with that intellective soul that makes it a human person in all respects? Traditional doctrine was very cautious on this point, and it was generally said to be 40 days. Thomas says only that the soul is created when the body of the fetus is ready to receive it. In the Summa, Part 3, Question 33, Article 2, Thomas asks whether Christ's soul was created at the same time as his body. Note that, since Christ's conception did not take place through the transfer of semen but through the grace of the Holy Spirit, it should not be surprising if in such a case God had created the fetus and the rational soul at the same time. But even Christ, as man and God, must follow human laws. The beginning of the infusion of the soul may be considered in two ways. First, in regard to the disposition of the body. In this sense the soul of Christ, like the soul of other men, was infused when his body was formed. Secondly, in relation to time alone. And thus, because Christ's body was perfectly formed in a shorter space of time than that of other men, so he also received his soul before them. But the problem here is not so much when a fetus becomes a human being, but whether the embryo is already a human being. And Thomas is very clear on this point, as we have seen. And even though the supplement to the Summa is not written by him but probably by his disciple Reginald of Piperno, it is interesting to read Question 80, Article 4. The problem is whether, upon the resurrection of bodies, all that has contributed to the growth of these bodies is resurrected. Several apparently grotesque questions arise from this. Food is transformed into substance of a human nature. Humans eat the flesh of oxen. Therefore, if what was the substance of a human nature is resurrected, will the flesh of oxen also be resurrected? It is impossible for one and the same thing to be resurrected in different men. And yet it is possible for something to have belonged in substance to different men, as in the case of the cannibal who eats human flesh, which is transformed into his own substance. Who then is resurrected, the eater or the one who is eaten? Question 80 is answered in a complex and tortuous manner and seems not to side with any of the various opinions. But what interests us is that at the end of the discussion it is said that natural beings are what they are, not in terms of matter, but in their form. Therefore, if the matter that first had the form of beef is then resurrected in man in the form of human flesh, it will certainly not do so as the flesh of an ox but as that of a human being. Otherwise it would mean that the mud from which Adam's body was created would also be resurrected. As for the question of cannibalism, according to one view, the flesh eaten never truly becomes part of the human nature of the person eating it, but remains that of the person who has been eaten. Such flesh will therefore be resurrected in the latter and not in the former. But the specific point that interests us is that, according to this question, embryos will not take part in the resurrection of the flesh unless they have first been animated by the rational soul. Now it would be infantile to ask Thomas to absolve those who carry out an abortion within a given period of time, and probably he didn't even think of the moral implications of his reasoning, which today we would describe as being purely scientific. It is curious, however, that the Church, which is always quoting the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, has decided on this point to distance itself tacitly from his position. Something similar has happened with the theory of evolution, with which the Church came to terms a long time ago. It was sufficient to interpret the 6 days of the creation figuratively, as the fathers of the Church have always done, and in this way there are no biblical objections to an evolutionary view. Indeed, the book of Genesis is an extremely Darwinian text because it tells us that the creation took place in stages from the least complex to the most complex, from mineral to vegetable, animal, and human. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind." And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind." And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 27 and 2 to 7. The choice of a battle against evolution and in defense of life, back as far as the embryo, seems rather more in line with the positions of Protestant fundamentalism. But, as I have said, this lecture was not intended to enter into present disputes but only to explain the thinking of Thomas Aquinas, with which the Church of Rome can do as it pleases. I therefore propose to stop here, leaving these documents for the consideration of my listeners. Lecture given on November 25, 2008, in Bologna, at the Scuola Superiore di Studi Umanistici, during a conference on the ethics of research, later published in the Proceedings, Etica della Ricerca Medica e Identità Culturale Europea, edited by Francesco Gallifaro, Bologna. CLUEB, 2009. Hugo, Ellis. The Poetics of Excess. Discussions about Victor Hugo usually start with a comment by Guide who, when asked who was the greatest French poet, replied, "Hugo, Ellis." Hugo, alas. Point 1. Anyone wanting to hit harder might go on to quote Cocteau. Victor Hugo was a madman who believed he was Victor Hugo. 2. Guide's lament meant many things, but now tends to be read as meaning that Hugo, and perhaps, in particular, Hugo the narrator, is a great writer despite his innumerable defects, his bombast, his sometimes insufferable rhetoric. Cocteau's quip, however, is not quite correct. Victor Hugo was not a madman who believed he was Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo simply believed he was God, or at least his official interpreter. In Hugo there is always an excess in the description of earthly events, and an indomitable desire to see them always from God's point of view. The taste for excess leads him to descriptions that become interminable lists, to the creation of characters whose psychological workings are always regarded as unsustainable, rough-hewn, but whose passions are taken to such levels of paroxysm as to become memorable, a sign of the forces that move history. His desire to be God enables him to see the great forces that move human history, above and beyond the events in which his heroes are involved, and if it is not God then it is fate. A destiny that is sometimes presented as providence and sometimes as an almost Hegelian plan that dominates and directs the desires of individuals. The taste for excess explains why one could mistake Hugo for the Almighty, a personality who, by definition, is larger than life, who convulses the abyss to create heaven and earth, unleashes universal floods, plunges sinners into the fiery bowels of Gehenna, and so forth. A little moderation, please. And also justifies the plaintive lament from Guide, who evidently identified art with Apollonian poise and not with Dionysian frenzy. I am perfectly aware of my passion for Hugo. Elsewhere I have praised his sublime excess, and excess can turn even bad writing and banality into a Wagnerian tempest. To explain the fascination of a film like Casablanca, I have noted 3 that while a single cliché is kitsch, Shamelessly letting fly 100 clichés makes an epic. And I have noted how The Count of Monte Cristo might be badly written, unlike other novels by Dumas, such as The Three Musketeers, and may be rambling and verbose, but it is precisely because of these defects, taken beyond reasonable limits, that it reaches that Kantian vision of the sublime, and justifies the hold it has had, and still has, on millions of readers. Point 4. But returning to Hugo, let us look at an area typical of romantic excess, the representation of ugliness and evil. From the time of Achilles to the dawn of Romanticism, the hero was always handsome, while from Thersites up until more or less the same period, the villain was always ugly, hideous, grotesque, or absurd. And when a hero is made from a villain, he becomes handsome, as with Milton's Satan. But by the time we reach the Gothic novel, the picture is reversed. Not only does the hero appear unsettling and fearsome, but the anti-hero also, in his darkness, becomes if not appealing at least interesting. Byron says of his Giaour that the glare beneath his dusky cowl was dark and unearthly, and his eye and his bitter smile aroused fear and guilt. And Anne Radcliffe, describing another dark spirit in The Italian, or The Confessional of the Black Penitents, tells us that his appearance was striking, his limbs large and uncouth, and as he stalked away, wrapped in the black habit of his order, his features expressed something terrible and almost superhuman, while his cowl, casting a shadow over the livid paleness of his face, gave a sense of horror to his large melancholy eyes. The figure of William Beckford's Vathek was pleasing and majestic, but when angry, one of his eyes became so terrible that no person could bear to behold it, and the wretch upon whom it was fixed fell instantly backward and sometimes died. For Stevenson, Hyde was pale and dwarfish, he gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation, he had a displeasing smile, behaved himself with a disturbing mixture of timidity and boldness, and spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice, which inspired disgust, loathing, and fear. Of Heathcliff, Emily Bronte writes that his forehead was shaded with a heavy cloud, his eyes were basilisks, and his lips seemed sealed in an expression of unspeakable sadness. And here is how Eugene Sue describes the schoolmaster in Les Mystères de Paris. His face scored in all directions with deep, livid scars. His lips swollen by the corrosive action of vitriol. The cartilage of his nose cut. His nostrils replaced by two shapeless holes. His head was disproportionately large. He had long arms and short, stubby hands, with hairy fingers, and bow legs and restless, mobile eyes, flashing like those of a wild beast. But Hugo too is excessive in his descriptions of ugliness, for reasons set out in his famous preface to Cromwell, where he theorizes comprehensively on the revolution of beauty, which, in the Romantic period, is transformed into its opposite, into ugliness and deformity, or at least into the grotesque. Modern ingenuity, he says, transforms giants into dwarfs. From cyclops gnomes are made. Contact with deformity has given modern sublimity something greater, more sublime than ancient beauty. The grotesque is the other face of the sublime, as shadow is to light. Grotesqueness is the richest resource nature can offer art. The universal beauty that antiquity solemnly gave to everything was not without its monotony, and this impression can produce tedium through repetition. Beauty is only of one kind, there are 1,000 kinds of ugliness. It is difficult to compare one sublime with another, and we need to take a rest from everything, even from beauty. The salamander makes the Ondine more attractive, the gnome makes Sisyphus more handsome. But Hugo is more radical when he is creating than when he is theorizing. Deformity is not only a form of evil that contrasts with beauty and goodness, it is, in itself, an atrocious and unsought modesty, as if God had wanted to conceal from others, under the guise of external ugliness, an inner beauty that is destined nonetheless to be lost. Hugo softens the irredeemable ugliness of the spider and the nettle. I love the spider and the nettle, because they hate us. O passerby, forgive that obscure plant, that poor animal, for their ugliness and their sting. Have pity on evil. Quasimodo, the hunchback of Notre Dame, has a tetrahedral nose and a horseshoe mouth. His left eye is obstructed by a red, bushy brow, while his right disappears under an enormous wart. His straggling teeth are broken here and there like the battlements of a fortress. A tooth protrudes from his calloused lip like the tusk of an elephant. He has a huge head, bristling with red hair, between his shoulders an enormous hump, large feet, monstrous hands, legs so strangely aligned that they could touch each other only at the knees and, viewed from the front, resembled the crescents of two scythes joined by the handles. To contrast this repellent aspect, Hugo gives Quasimodo a sensitive soul and a great capacity to love. But he reaches the highest point with the figure of Gwynplaine, the man who laughs. Gwynplaine is not only the ugliest of all and, due to his ugliness, the unhappiest, he is also the most pure-spirited of all, capable of infinite love. And, paradox of romantic ugliness, monstrous as he is, and precisely because he is monstrous, he stirs the desires of the most beautiful woman in London. For those who have forgotten the story, let us summarize it. The scion of a noble family, kidnapped as a child in a political feud, Gwynplaine is transformed by Comprachicos into a grotesque mask, his features surgically disfigured, and he is condemned to an eternal smile. Nature had been prodigal of her kindness to Gwynplaine. She had bestowed on him a mouth opening to his ears folding over to his eyes, a shapeless nose to support the spectacles of the grimace maker, and a face that no one could look upon without laughing. But was it nature? Had she not been assisted? 2 slits for eyes, a hiatus for a mouth, a snub protuberance with 2 holes for nostrils, a flattened face, all having for the result an appearance of laughter, it is certain that nature never produces such perfection single-handed. Such a face could never have been created by chance, it must have resulted from intention. Had Gwynplaine when a child been so worthy of attention that his face had been subjected to transmutation? Why not? Needed there a greater motive than the speculation of his future exhibition? According to all appearance, industrious manipulators of children had worked upon his face. It seemed evident that a mysterious and probably occult science, which was to surgery what alchemy was to chemistry, had chiseled his flesh, evidently at a very tender age, and manufactured his countenance with premeditation. That science, clever with the knife, skilled in obtrusions and ligatures, had enlarged the mouth, cut away the lips, laid bare the gums, distended the ears, cut the cartilages, displaced the eyelids and the cheeks, enlarged the zygomatic muscle, pressed the scars and cicatrices to a level, turned back the skin over the lesions whilst the face was thus stretched, from all which resulted that powerful and profound piece of sculpture, the mask, Gwynplaine. Part 2, Book 2, Chapter 1. With this mask, Gwynplaine becomes an acrobat, highly popular with audiences. Since childhood he has been in love with Dea, a blind girl who performs with him. Gwynplaine had eyes for only one woman in the whole world, that blind creature. Dea idolized Gwynplaine. She would touch him and say, "How beautiful you are." Until two things happen. Lady Josiane, the queen's sister, adored by all the gentlemen of the court for her beauty, sees Gwynplaine at the theatre, sends him a letter. "You are hideous, I am beautiful. You are a player, I am a duchess. I am the highest, you are the lowest. I desire you. I love you. Come." Gwynplaine grapples between his feelings of excitement and desire, and his love for Dea. Then something happens. He thinks he has been arrested. He is questioned, and brought face to face with a bandit who is dying. In short, all of a sudden he has been recognized as Lord Fermain Clancharlie, Baron of Clancharlie and Hunkerville, Marquis of Corleone in Sicily, and an English peer, who had been kidnapped and disfigured at a tender age in a family feud. We move onward by leaps and bounds, as Gwynplaine suddenly finds himself propelled from the gutter to the stars, hardly realizing what is going on, except that at a certain point he finds himself, extravagantly dressed, in the room of a palace that, he is told, is his. It seems to him like an enchanted palace, and already the series of marvels he discovers there, alone in the resplendent desert, the succession of halls and chambers, is bewildering not only to him but to the reader. It is no coincidence that the title of the chapter is The Resemblance of a Palace to a Wood, and the description of what seems like the Louvre or the Hermitage takes up 5 or 6 pages, depending on the edition. Gwynplaine wanders, dazed, from room to room until he reaches an alcove where, on the bed, beside a tub of water made ready for a virginal bath, he sees a naked woman. Not literally naked, Hugo tells us. She is clothed. But the description of this clothed woman, especially if we see her through the eyes of Gwynplaine, who has never seen a naked woman, certainly represents one of the heights of erotic literature. At the center of this web, where one might expect a spider, Gwynplaine saw a formidable object, a woman naked. Not literally naked, she was dressed, and dressed from head to foot. The dress was a long chemise, so long that it floated over her feet, like the dresses of angels in holy pictures, but so fine that it seemed liquid. From here, the appearance of female nudity, more treacherous and dangerous than real nudity. The silver tissue, transparent as glass, was a curtain. It was fastened only at the ceiling, could be lifted aside. On that bed, which was silver like the bath and the canopy, lay the woman. She was asleep. Between her nudity and his gaze there were 2 obstacles, her chemise and the silver veil, 2 transparencies. The room, more an alcove than a room, was lit with a sort of discretion from the light reflected from the bathroom. The woman may have had no modesty, but the lighting did. The bed had neither columns nor canopy, so that the woman, when she opened her eyes, could see herself 1,000 times naked in the mirrors above her. Gwynplaine saw only the woman. He recognized her. She was the Duchess. Again he saw her, and saw her terrible. A woman naked as a woman armed. That immodesty was merged in splendor. That creature lay naked with the same calm of one with the divine right of cynicism. She had the security of an Olympian who knew that she was daughter of the depths, and might say to the ocean, "Father." And she exposed herself, unattainable and proud, to everything that should pass, to looks, to desires, to ravings, to dreams, as proud in her languor, on her boudoir couch, as Venus in the immensity of foam. Part 2, Book 7, Chapter 3. And so Josiane awakens, recognizes Gwynplaine, and begins a furious seduction, which the poor man can no longer resist, except that she brings him to the peak of desire but does not yield. She erupts into a series of fantasies, more stimulating than her own nudity, in which she reveals herself as a virgin, as she still is, and a prostitute, anxious to enjoy not only the pleasures of the teratology that Gwynplaine promises her, but also the thrill of defying the world and the court, a prospect that intoxicates her. She is a Venus awaiting the double orgasm of private possession and public exhibition of her Vulcan. I feel degraded in your presence, and oh, what happiness that is! How insipid it is to be a grandee! I am noble, what can be more tiresome? Disgrace is a comfort. I am so satiated with respect that I long for contempt. I love you, not only because you are deformed, but because you are low. I love monsters, and I love mountebanks. A lover despised, mocked, grotesque, hideous, exposed to laughter on that pillory called a theater, has for me an extraordinary attraction. It is tasting the fruit of hell. An infamous lover, how exquisite. To taste the apple, not of paradise, but of hell, such is my temptation. It is for that I hunger and thirst. I am that Eve, the Eve of the depths. Probably you are, unknown to yourself, a devil. I am in love with a nightmare. You are a moving puppet, of which the strings are pulled by a specter. You are the incarnation of infernal mirth. Gwynplaine, I am the throne, you are the footstool. Let us join on the same level. Oh, how happy I am in my fall. I wish all the world could know how abject I am become. It would bow down all the lower. The more man abhors, the more does he cringe. It is human nature, hostile, but reptile, dragon, but worm. Oh, I am as depraved as are the gods. Now, you are not ugly, you are deformed. Ugliness is mean, deformity is grand. Ugliness is the devil's grin behind beauty. Deformity is the reverse of sublimity. I love you, she cried. And she bit him with a kiss. Part 2, Book 7, Chapter 4. Just as Gwynplaine is about to yield, a message arrives from the queen, telling her sister that the man who laughs has been recognized as the rightful lord. Clancharlie, and that he is to be her husband. Josiane comments, be it so. She gets up, gives him her hand, moving from familiar to formal address, saying, get out, to the man she had so wildly sought to seduce, and adds, since you are my husband, get out. You have no right to be here, this place is for my lover. Gwynplaine is excessive in his disfigurement. Josiane is excessive in her initial sadomasochism, excessive in her reaction. There is another reversal in the situation, which has already been reversed through a normal recognition device. You are not an acrobat but a lord, and added to by a double change of fortune. You were a wretch, now you are not only a lord but desired by the most beautiful woman in the realm, whom you too now desire with all your confused and disturbed soul, and this would be enough as comedy, if not as tragedy. The reversal, however, is not into tragedy, at least not for the moment. Gwynplaine will kill himself only at the end, but into a grotesque farce. The reader is exhausted and, all of a sudden, understands the threads of destiny as well as the weave of gallant society of that century. Hugo has no shame. Compared to him, Josiane is as prim as a saint. And now we come to the other reversal of fortune. Gwynplaine, who, after the episode with Josiane, had already begun to understand the laws and powers and customs that she represents, enters the House of Lords and is greeted with suspicion and curiosity. He does nothing to make himself accepted. Indeed, at the first vote he stands up and makes a passionate appeal in support of the people, and against the aristocracy who are exploiting them. It is a passage worthy of Marx's Das Kapital, but when spoken with a face that laughs even when it is expressing scorn, passion, pain, and love for the truth, it stirs not scorn but hilarity. The sitting ends in fun and laughter. Gwynplaine understands that this cannot be his world, and after a desperate search, returns to Dia. She, alas, suffering more from the loss of her lover than from the illness that has afflicted her for some time, dies happily in his arms. Gwynplaine does not hold back. Divided between two worlds, one that disowns him and the other that has gone, he kills himself. Thus, in Gwynplaine, the quintessential romantic hero, we find a synthesis of all the elements of the romantic novel. Purest passion, the temptation and fascination of sin, the rapid reversals of fortune with his passage from the depths of poverty to the magnificence of the court, his titanic rebellion against the world of injustice, his heroic testimony to truth, even at the cost of losing everything, the death of his lover from consumption, a destiny crowned by his own suicide. But everything highly exaggerated. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, though an early work, shows all the signs of a poetics of excess. In the opening chapters, to create the idea of public celebration and the participation of the aristocracy as well as members of the bourgeoisie and the populace, to create the impression of Grillemont, to use Hugo's word, of a teeming mass, the reader has to digest a vast series of names of characters who may be historical but are completely unfamiliar and therefore meaningless. Heaven help anyone who tries to identify them or to find out anything about them. It is like watching a procession, perhaps a July 14th parade in Paris or Trooping the Colour in London, where we cannot identify the various regiments from their uniforms and know nothing about their history, but are struck by the immensity of the parade, and woe betide us if we see only half of it, since we will lose the charm and majesty of the event. Hugo never says to us, there was a crowd. He puts us right there in the middle of it, as if he is presenting each of its members to us one by one. We can shake a few hands, pretend to recognize someone we ought to know, and then return home with the feeling of experiencing its immensity. The same can be said about Gringoire's Dantesque visit to the Court of Miracles, among villains, vagrants, beggars, defrocked priests, young delinquents, whores, gypsies, narcois, coquille arts, Hubins, Sabuyo, false cripples, cutpurses, scoundrels, and so on. We don't need to recognize them all. It is the descriptions of them that create the effect. We have to feel the place teeming with criminals and wretches to understand this turbulent festering swamp population who, many chapters later, will attack the cathedral like an immense colony of termites, sewer rats, cockroaches, locusts. The protagonist is not one person but the mass. In short, we have to learn to read through the inventories, lists, catalogs like a flow of music. And then we become absorbed into the book. And we arrive at the point where the poetics of excess is apparent through the technique of the catalog and the list. Hugo uses this technique on countless occasions, but perhaps it is used most continuously, most completely and convincingly in 93. Though we might be able to spot and list many shortcomings in this book, above all, the rhetorical incontinence. As we thrust the knife deeper in the wound, they begin to appear splendid to us. It would be like a devotee of Bach and his disembodied, almost cerebral compositions, saying that Beethoven creates more noise in comparison with those fine pieces for the well-tempered clavier. But to what purpose? Can we resist the power of the fifth or the ninth? We can avoid indulging in a Pantagruelian feast, but once we have accepted the rules of the game, there is no point remembering the dietitian's advice or longing for the delicate sensations of nouvelle cuisine. If we have the stomach to join the orgy, it will be an unforgettable experience. Otherwise, it is better to leave straight away and lull ourselves to sleep reading a few aphorisms by an 18th century gentleman. Hugo is not for the faint-hearted. Yet while the Battle of Hernani is later than Sturm und Drang, the shadow of that storm and that assault still illuminates The Last Romantic in 1874, the date of the novel's publication, though not of its gestation. To understand just how 93 is fueled by excess, let us look at the story, which, all in all, is very simple, though heavily melodramatic, and in the hands of an Italian opera librettist could have produced the equivalent, perhaps, of Tosca or Il Trovatore. By which I mean their plots, without the music that allows us to take the verses more seriously. It is the annus horribilis of the revolution. The Vendée is in revolt. An old aristocrat with a glorious military past, the Marquis de Lantenac, comes ashore to take command of the peasant masses, who emerge like devils from mysterious forests and shoot while they recite the rosary. The revolution, in the form of the convention, has set its men against him. First there is Gavain, Lantenac's nephew, a young aristocrat turned republican, a man of feminine beauty fired with warlike fervor, but an angelic utopian who still hopes that the conflict can be settled in a spirit of compassion and respect for the enemy. Then we meet Chimordain, a man we'd call a political advisor today. He is a former priest, as ruthless as Lantenac, who is convinced that social and political regeneration will happen only through a bloodbath, and that every hero pardoned today will become the enemy who will kill us tomorrow. Chimordain, moreover, melodrama does have its demands, was Gavain's tutor when he was a child and loves him like a son. Hugo never allows us to think of a passion different from that of a man, first celibate through faith and later through revolutionary vocation, who is consecrated to spiritual fatherhood, but who knows? Chimordain's passion is ferocious, complete, and carnally